Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mr. Geronimo. Subscribe to stay with us and tell us your country in the comments. The mountains of West Virginia hold secrets that tourists never discover. That is the first lesson I learned before everything went wrong in July. My name is Sean Warren, and what I am about to share happened to me and 5 other people during what was supposed to be a peaceful summer holiday in the wilderness. We all believed we were prepared. We all believed we were safe. By the end, I learned that belief itself is a luxury that mountains do not permit. I organized the trip during a casual conversation at work. It was supposed to be a simple expedition, a week-long hiking adventure through some of the most remote trails in the Appalachian region. I had gathered 5 companions for this journey. There was Judy Dixon, a woman in her 60s with decades of camping experience who never missed an opportunity to test her endurance. Philip Ramos, at 73 years old, was the oldest among us, and he carried with him a quiet determination and an encyclopedia of knowledge about wilderness survival. Megan Black, only 32, was the athletic one, the one who could outpace us all with barely a heavy breath. Victor Holmes, 57, was my best friend from college, always eager for adventure even as the years added weight to his frame. And then there was Irene Stone, a photographer in her 50s who wanted to capture the raw beauty of the mountains through her lens. We arrived at our base camp on July 3rd, just outside the Monongahela National Forest. The weather was perfect that first day. Sunshine filtered through the canopy in golden rays, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. We spent the afternoon setting up our camp on a wide clearing near a stream, arranging our tents in a loose semicircle. The clearing had obviously been used by other campers before. There were rings of blackened stones from old fires scattered across the ground, and a weathered log that served as a bench near what we designated as our gathering spot. Philip suggested that we establish ground rules immediately. He was the type of man who believed organization prevented disaster. We agreed that no one would wander more than 100 yards from camp without a partner. We established a system where we would check in with each other every 2 hours during the day. We set specific hiking routes and designated trails. We were reasonable people taking reasonable precautions. What we did not anticipate was that reasonable precautions mean nothing when you are standing in front of something that should not exist. That first evening, Judy prepared a meal from the supplies we had brought. She was an excellent cook, and she had made this expedition about more than just survival. There were fresh vegetables, seasoned meat, and bread that she had baked before our departure. We sat around our fire as darkness settled over the mountains, and the stars began to reveal themselves above us. Victor made jokes about city life. Megan talked about her upcoming marathon training. Philip shared stories about other expeditions he had undertaken in his younger years. Irene adjusted her camera settings, trying to capture the right exposure for the night sky. I remember feeling content. There was something primal and essential about sitting around a fire in the mountains, surrounded by people you trust, separated from the world by nothing but distance and altitude. I remember thinking that this was what people meant when they talked about feeling alive. I did not know then that before this week ended, I would understand the full meaning of that word, stripped of its comfortable, casual application. We retired to our tents around 11 o'clock. The mountain air was cool despite the summer season, and I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sounds of the forest. Wind through the trees, the distant trickle of the stream, the occasional nocturnal creature moving through the underbrush. These were the expected sounds of wilderness. I had heard them before on other camping trips. I would hear them again, but they would never sound quite the same after that week. The next morning, we woke to find evidence that something had visited our camp during the night. It was a small thing, easy to dismiss. One of our food containers, which we had hung in a bag from a sturdy branch of a nearby tree, had been moved. It was hanging at a different height than we had secured it. Judy noticed this immediately when she went to prepare breakfast. She called over Philip and Victor. The 3 of them examined the rope in the bag, conducting an impromptu investigation that I watched from near the fire. Victor concluded it was likely a raccoon or perhaps a bear that had investigated our supplies during the night. Philip disagreed. He pointed out that the rope had not been damaged, and the way the bag had been moved suggested something larger than a raccoon, something that could reach high enough to unhook the bag and rehang it at a lower level. Bears were not that precise. They would have torn the bag down entirely and destroyed it in their search for food. This behavior suggested something else, something methodical, something almost deliberate in its exploration of our camp. I remember Judy saying something that struck me as odd at the moment. She said that it felt like whatever had visited us was not looking for food, it was looking for something else. It was investigating us, the way we might investigate something unfamiliar that appeared in our backyard. I told her she was being overly dramatic, that mountain animals were curious by nature. She did not argue further, but I noticed her eyes lingering on the surrounding forest for the rest of the morning. We decided to proceed with our planned hike for that day. We had mapped out a route that would take us through a valley and up to a ridge overlooking the forest. It was supposed to be moderately challenging, a 6-mile round trip that would take us 5 to 6 hours depending on our pace. Philip, Victor, and Megan formed one group. Judy, Irene, and I formed another group. We agreed to stay on the marked trail, to maintain contact via our radios every 30 minutes, and to meet back at camp by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The valley itself was beautiful in a way that photographs cannot truly capture. The mountains rose on either side of us in layers of green and shadow, each ridge growing fainter and more blue as the distance increased. The trail was well maintained, and we made good progress. Judy was quiet for most of the hike, which was unusual for her. She was normally talkative, making observations about the plants and trees we passed, sharing information about their uses and histories. That day, she seemed preoccupied with something. I asked her several times if she was feeling well, and she assured me she was fine, just lost in thought. Irene took photographs constantly. She was trying to capture the interplay of light and shadow on the mountainsides, the way the ferns and moss created texture on the forest floor, the patterns of bark on the ancient trees. She would stop and lag behind, and Judy and I would have to wait for her to catch up. Around 2 o'clock, we reached the ridge that was our destination. The view from this point was spectacular. We could see for miles across the Appalachian landscape, an endless series of mountains and valleys stretching toward a distant haze of atmosphere. We rested there for 30 minutes, eating the lunch we had packed, drinking water, recovering our energy. I tried to reach Victor on the radio to check in. He responded immediately, reporting that they were having a good hike, enjoying the trail, and were on their way back. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should have been. As we began our descent, Judy suddenly stopped on the trail and turned to look at me. Her expression had changed. There was something in her eyes that I had not seen before, something that looked almost like recognition, as though she had just remembered something important and terrible. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, Irene called out from ahead of us on the trail. Irene had found something. She was standing near a large boulder, about 20 yards ahead, beckoning us to come and see. Judy and I exchanged a look, and we walked toward her. When we reached her position, I saw what had captured her attention. There were scratches on the boulder, deep gouges in the stone that could not have been made by any ordinary animal. They were parallel marks, almost perfectly spaced, as though something with large claws or hands had raked across the surface with tremendous force. I ran my fingers over the scratches. The stone was not fresh. These marks had been made weeks or even months ago, but the edges were not weathered smooth. This stone face was protected from the rain and wind by a slight overhang, which had preserved the scratches in a startlingly clear condition. Philip would later estimate that whatever had made these marks had possessed claws or nails approximately 6 inches in length. He would make that estimate while staring into the fire at camp that evening, his voice remarkably steady despite the implications of his own words. Judy told us then that she had felt something during the previous night. She had not said anything because she was not certain of what she had felt. It was a presence, a weight of attention, as though something had been standing near her tent, watching her sleep. She had heard no sound, felt no direct threat, but she had known without any doubt that something was there. She had waited in silence until the feeling had passed, and then she had tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than anxiety, the natural weariness of someone sleeping in the wilderness. We did not linger at the boulder. We increased our pace on the way back to camp, moving faster than was comfortable on the trail. Irene kept her camera down, no longer stopping to photograph. None of us spoke. There was something unspoken hanging in the air between us, a mutual acknowledgement that something was not right about our situation, even though we had no concrete evidence of any real threat. We arrived back at camp at 4:30. Victor, Philip, and Megan were already there, gathered around the fire. They looked unconcerned at first, but their expressions changed when they saw our faces. Victor immediately asked what had happened. I found myself hesitant to answer, uncertain how to explain what we had found without sounding irrational. Philip spoke first, asking to see the photographs Irene had taken. We gathered around Irene's camera as she scrolled through her images. She showed us the photograph she had taken of the scratched boulder. Seeing the marks enlarged on the small screen made them seem more ominous, more undeniably real. Philip studied the image carefully. He did not make any of his usual observations or jokes. He simply handed the camera back to Irene and said nothing. That is when Victor mentioned the prints. He had noticed them during their hike, he said. Prints on the trail, large and unusual. He had thought at the time that they were made by a deer or perhaps a large dog, but he had not mentioned them because he was uncertain. Now, seeing the scratches on the boulder, he was no longer uncertain. The prints had been made by something much larger than any common animal. Something that did not match any description of fauna that Victor, who had spent considerable time in the wilderness, could identify. Megan had something to add. She had heard a sound during their hike, just for a moment, a sound that was almost like a bleat or a cry of some kind, but deeper and more complex than anything she had heard before. She had pointed it out to Victor, and he had listened, and then the sound had stopped. They had heard nothing more after that, but the sound had stayed with her, and she had found herself scanning the forest with more weariness for the rest of their hike. As darkness fell around our camp, we noticed something else. The birds had gone quiet. During the day, the forest had been alive with bird calls and other animal sounds. Now, as evening approached, there was silence. It was not a natural silence, not the kind that comes with sunset. It was the silence of attention, of waiting, of creatures that had fallen quiet because something had made them wary. Even the insects seemed to have stopped their normal chorus. We prepared dinner that evening without much conversation. Judy's earlier meal had been prepared with enthusiasm and care. Tonight, we simply ate what she provided with little appreciation and less discussion. Afterward, we moved our tents closer together, overlapping our camping area so that we were not spread out across the clearing as we had been the first night. Philip suggested that we maintain a watch during the night, 2 people awake at all times, rotating every 2 hours. No one argued. I took the first watch with Victor. We sat on either side of the fire, feeding it occasionally with wood from our supply, keeping it bright and warm. Victor asked me what I thought we had encountered. I did not have an answer that made sense. I said that perhaps we had stumbled onto a region where bears were more active than we had anticipated. Victor nodded at this explanation, but we both knew it was inadequate. Bears did not leave marks like those on the boulder. Bears did not investigate camps with methodical precision. Bears did not create silence in the forest. Around midnight, something moved at the edge of the clearing. It was only a brief movement, barely more than a shifting of shadows, but both Victor and I saw it. We both turned toward it simultaneously, as though synchronized by some invisible signal. I stood and walked toward the edge of camp, stopping just at the boundary where the firelight faded into darkness. I could see the faint outline of trees and underbrush, but nothing more specific than that. Victor called my name quietly, a warning. I turned back to him. He was holding the shotgun we had brought with us. I had forgotten that we had packed it. Victor had wanted it for protection against bears, though we had hoped never to need it. He had checked it that morning before our hike and confirmed that it was loaded. Now he was holding it with the kind of careful attention that suggested his mind had moved beyond the theoretical possibility of danger into something more immediate. I returned to the fire and sat back down. We did not see that movement again. Whether it had been an animal, a trick of the firelight and our nervous imaginations, or something else, I could not determine. We sat in silence for the remainder of our watch, listening to the night sounds of the forest and attending to every shift in shadow around the perimeter of our camp. At 2 o'clock, Judy and Philip relieved us. I watched as they took their positions, and I noticed that Philip also carried the rifle we had brought. I retired to my tent with Victor's words echoing in my mind. He had squeezed my shoulder as we passed in the darkness and said simply, "We should leave tomorrow, first light." I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my tent, listening to the forest, hyper-aware of every sound, convinced that I could feel that same presence that Judy had described, an invisible attention focused on the thin fabric wall of my shelter. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because morning arrived with a suddenness that felt like waking from a nightmare. We left camp the next morning without finishing breakfast. Philip had called an immediate gathering at dawn, and he had laid out his assessment with the directness of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. He said that we had encountered something unusual, something that warranted caution and possibly evacuation. Megan wanted to know what Philip thought we had encountered specifically. Philip would only say that it was too early for definitive conclusions, but he believed that our safety would be better served by relocating to a town and requesting information from local authorities who might be more familiar with the wildlife behavior in this region. Victor supported this suggestion immediately. Judy and Irene exchanged a look that suggested they had been expecting this possibility. Megan seemed reluctant to abandon the expedition, but she did not voice strong objection. By 7 o'clock we had packed down our camp, loaded our equipment into our vehicles, and we were driving away from the clearing that had been our base of operations. Philip directed us to the town of Lewisburg, which was roughly an hour drive from our camp location. Once we arrived, we checked into a small motel that did not seem to get much business. The proprietor was a woman in her 60s who regarded us with clear curiosity as we registered. Philip asked her if she was familiar with the wildlife in the surrounding region. The woman regarded Philip carefully before answering. She said that the region around the national forest had its share of wildlife, both common and unusual. She asked why we were inquiring. Philip explained that we had been camping and had observed some animal signs that we could not readily identify. The proprietor's expression changed slightly. She asked Philip to describe these signs. As Philip described the scratches we had found and the prints Victor had observed, the woman's face went very still. When Philip finished speaking, there was a silence that seemed to stretch for an uncomfortable length of time. Finally, she told us that we should speak with a man named Tom Cullen. He was a biologist who worked with the Forest Service and lived in Lewisburg. He had spent considerable time researching the wildlife of the region. She provided us with a phone number. Philip called the number immediately. Tom Cullen agreed to meet with us within the hour at a local coffee shop. When we gathered in that coffee shop, Tom seemed unsurprised by our arrival. He was a man in his 50s, weathered by outdoor work, with the kind of calm authority that came from genuine expertise. He listened as Philip described our encounter in detail, and I could see the moment of recognition in Tom's eyes. He had heard these descriptions before, many times. Tom told us that we had almost certainly encountered what locals referred to as the Sheepsquatch. It was a creature that had been reported in the region for decades, though most of the reports came from residents rather than tourists. The creature was large, perhaps 6 to 8 feet in height, with a body covered in thick wool or hair that some witnesses described as resembling sheep's wool. It possessed claws, powerful limbs, and what appeared to be enhanced intelligence. Most importantly, it was territorial and curious about human intrusion into its domain. Megan asked if this creature actually existed or if it was simply folklore. Tom answered carefully. He said that unexplained animal prints, scratches, and vocalizations had been documented repeatedly in the region. He had personally investigated several of these incidents. Whether the creature was a previously unclassified animal, a cryptid that had avoided scientific classification, or a misidentification of known fauna, he could not say with certainty. What he could say was that something existed in those mountains, something that was capable of inspiring genuine fear in experienced outdoors people. Victor asked if the creature was dangerous. Tom said that there had been no documented fatal attacks, but there had been incidents of livestock disappearance and 1 or 2 reports of aggressive behavior toward humans who had approached the creature too closely. The Sheepsquatch, as far as Tom could determine, preferred to avoid direct human conflict, but it would respond to threats or perceived threats with considerable force. Judy asked the question that all of us had been avoiding. She asked if we had been in actual danger during our night at camp. Tom paused before answering. He said that our behavior had likely been cautious enough to avoid an escalation of contact. If we had approached the creature aggressively or had attempted to pursue it, the outcome might have been very different. By maintaining distance and recognizing signs of something unusual, we had made choices that had kept us safe. But yes, we had been in danger. We simply had not recognized the full extent of it. The conversation continued for several more hours. Tom shared his own theories about the creature's origins. He suggested that it might be a relict population of an unknown species, something that had survived in the isolated mountain terrain away from human civilization. Or it might be a large primate, though there were no known wild primates native to North America. Or it might be something else entirely, an animal that did not fit into any established taxonomic category. The uncertainty itself was unsettling. It meant that we could not predict the creature's behavior based on knowledge of similar species, because there were no similar species. Tom offered to escort us on a return hike to the site where we had found the scratched boulder. He wanted to examine the marks more closely and to look for additional evidence that might help him understand what we had encountered. Victor immediately declined this offer. Philip, however, considered it carefully. He said that he would like to return with Tom, but he would do so without the rest of our party. Philip believed that the person most likely to understand and respect the creature's territory was someone who was experienced with wilderness research and who could conduct a focused investigation without the distraction of managing a group of frightened tourists. We agreed to wait in Lewisburg while Philip and Tom returned to the area. Judy was furious at this decision. She argued that it was reckless and unnecessary, that we had learned what we needed to learn, and that there was no benefit to putting Philip in danger by returning to the forest. Philip, however, was resolute. He said that understanding what we had encountered was important, not just for our own peace of mind, but because this information might help to prevent future confrontations with the creature. So Philip and Tom left that afternoon, taking equipment for an overnight camping expedition. The rest of us checked back into the motel and spent the evening in the common room, attempting to distract ourselves by watching television. None of us were truly engaged with what was playing on the screen. Our attention was divided between the present moment and the forest where Philip and Tom were conducting their investigation. Philip and Tom returned the following morning. Philip looked haggard and exhausted, as though he had not slept well. Tom looked more energized, but there was something unsettled in his expression. We gathered immediately to hear what they had discovered. Philip began by saying that we had been right to take the signs seriously. There was much more evidence at the site than we had observed during our initial hike. Tom had shown him prints in the surrounding areas that were far more extensive than the ones Victor had noticed. There were also marks on other boulders in the vicinity, evidence of the creature's regular presence in that region. Most significantly, they had found scat and also samples of hair caught on low branches that suggested the creature was actively using that area as part of its territory. Tom added that he had also heard vocalizations during the night. They were exactly as Megan had described, a bleat-like sound, but with a deeper resonance and a complexity that suggested a high degree of intelligence. The sound came from a distance, never approaching their camp, but it had repeated several times throughout the night. Tom's assessment was that the creature was aware of their presence and was monitoring them, possibly assessing whether they represented a threat or an intrusion that needed to be discouraged. Victor asked if Philip had ever felt threatened during the night. Philip considered this question carefully before responding. He said that he had felt observed, the same sensation that Judy had described during our first night at camp. But he had not felt physically threatened. The creature's behavior had been consistent with an animal that was curious but cautious, not with an animal that was preparing to attack. This suggested to Philip that the creature possessed some capacity for evaluating humans and making decisions about how to respond to them. Irene asked if Tom believed that the creature might continue to follow us, even now that we had left the immediate area. Tom said that it was unlikely. We had made no aggressive overtures. We had retreated from the territory in a manner that was consistent with non-threatening behavior. The creature had likely interpreted our departure as a wise choice on our part, an acknowledgement of its dominance over its territory. There was no reason for it to pursue us beyond its territorial boundaries. The question that emerged from this exchange was whether we would continue with our planned week of mountain hiking or whether we would abandon the trip entirely and return to our homes. Megan argued that we should attempt the rest of the week, but in a different location, perhaps several hours driving distance away. She said that we had not actually been harmed, that we had learned something genuinely remarkable, and that abandoning the entire trip would feel like an unwarranted capitulation to fear. Judy countered this argument by saying that fear existed for a reason. It was a survival mechanism, and when we were in a situation that generated that response, it was wise to listen to it rather than to attempt to override it through rationalization. She reminded us that we had come to the mountains for pleasure, not for danger. There was no shame in choosing safety over adventure. After considerable discussion, we reached a compromise. We would spend one more night in Lewisburg, resting and recovering from the stress of the previous 2 days. Then we would attempt a modified version of our mountain expedition, this time in a more populated area, closer to established facilities, and with more frequent contact with the outside world. We would proceed, but we would do so with more caution and more realistic understanding of the risks we might encounter. Tom offered to recommend a location for us. He suggested a less remote area of the national forest, one that was heavily used by tourists and well maintained by the Forest Service. The area had no documented Sheepsquatch activity, and it would provide us with the mountain experience we had sought without the element of genuine danger that had characterized our initial location. We accepted his recommendation. The next morning, we packed our vehicles again and drove to the new location. It was indeed more touristy, with established parking areas, well-marked trails, and what seemed like a much higher level of human activity. We set up our camp in a designated camping area, surrounded by other campers who were engaged in the same summer hiking expedition that we had intended to undertake. The difference was remarkable. Here, there was no silence. There were people everywhere, laughter, music from radios, the comfortable sounds of human civilization imposed upon the wilderness. That night, I sat around the fire with Victor, and he asked me what I had learned from our experience with the Sheepsquatch. I told him that I had learned that the world was not fully mapped, that there were still mysteries in it, and that facing those mysteries required more than just physical preparation. It required a capacity to accept uncertainty and to respect forces that we did not fully understand. Victor nodded at this observation. He told me that he had reached a different conclusion. He said that he had learned that the world was far more dangerous than he had previously acknowledged, and that this danger was not something that could be overcome through courage or preparation. It could only be avoided through awareness and retreat. He said that he had no desire to encounter the Sheepsquatch again, or any creature like it. He simply wanted to return to his regular life, to the parts of the world that had been mapped and categorized and made safe through human presence. I understood his position. But I also understood that there were parts of me that did not want to forget what we had encountered. The experience had changed something in my perception of the natural world. I no longer saw the wilderness as simply a place of beauty and recreation. I saw it as a place of mysteries and forces that existed beyond the boundaries of our understanding. We spent the next 4 days at the more touristy location, and they passed without incident. The trails we hiked were beautiful but crowded. The wildlife we encountered consisted of common deer, squirrels, and birds. There were no scratches on boulders, no unusual prints, no sense of being observed by something intelligent and alien. On our 5th day in the mountains, Tom Cullen contacted Philip by phone with news that made us reconsider everything we thought we had learned. A hiker had gone missing in an area of the national forest approximately 15 miles north of our initial camp location. The hiker was a man in his 40s who had set out alone for a day hike and had not returned to his vehicle by the expected time. A search was underway, but so far there was no sign of him. The area where the man had gone missing was within what Tom considered to be documented Sheepsquatch territory. Tom had mentioned the missing hiker in what seemed like a casual context at first, but his underlying concern became apparent as the conversation continued. He asked if any of us had observed anything unusual at our initial camp that might have indicated escalated behavior from the creature. Anything that might suggest it had become more aggressive or more active. Philip assured Tom that everything we had experienced had been cautious and observational rather than aggressive. There had been no attacks, no direct threats, no indication that the creature was interested in harming us. Tom seemed somewhat relieved by this assessment, but he remained clearly troubled by the missing hiker situation. Over the next 3 days, we learned that the search for the missing hiker had been unsuccessful. The man had vanished without a trace. The only evidence that had been discovered was his vehicle, parked at a trailhead, and a small amount of personal equipment that he had left behind. There was no sign of him, no remains, no indication of what had happened to him. The official explanation from the Forest Service was that the hiker had likely become lost and had either been injured in a fall or had wandered into some remote area where rescue teams could not easily reach him. It was described as a tragic accident, a reminder of the dangers of hiking alone in mountainous terrain. The search was eventually called off, and the case remained open, pending any new discoveries. But we all understood the unspoken implication. Tom had not explicitly stated it, but the timing was too coincidental, the location too specific. Somewhere in those mountains, the Sheepsquatch had encountered a human, and that human had disappeared. Whether the creature had been responsible for the disappearance, or whether the hiker had simply ventured into a place where help was impossible to access, we could not know for certain. Victor was deeply affected by this news. He became withdrawn and silent, spending much of his time sitting at the camp and staring into the distance. Judy attempted to comfort him, but he did not respond well to her efforts. Finally, on our last night at the camp, Victor asked to speak with me privately. We walked away from the camp and stood on a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of forest. The sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and red and purple. Victor told me something that he had not shared with the others. He told me that on the second night at our initial camp, when the rest of us had been sleeping, he had gotten up to urinate. As he had walked to the edge of camp, he had seen something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. It had been large, and it had stood on two legs like a human, but its proportions had been all wrong. The head was too large and misshapen, the shoulders too broad, the arms too long. The light from the fire had not illuminated it clearly, so Victor could not describe it in precise detail. But there was no doubt in his mind about what he had seen. It was the Sheepsquatch, and it had been standing at the very edge of our camp, watching us sleep. Victor had not called out for help. He had not retreated quickly or made any sudden movements. He had simply stood there, staring at the creature, and the creature had stared back. They had regarded each other for perhaps 30 seconds, though Victor acknowledged that his sense of time might have been distorted by fear. Then the creature had turned and walked slowly away into the darkness, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. I asked Victor why he had not told us about this encounter. He said that he had been afraid that the knowledge would terrify us unnecessarily. He had hoped that if he remained silent, we would continue to believe that we had only been observed from a distance, that we had never been in direct proximity to the creature. He had also been unsure about what we would have done if we had known that the creature had come so close to our camp. The logical decision would have been to leave immediately, and Victor had not wanted to be responsible for forcing that choice upon us. I told Victor that his silence had been a mistake, that we needed to know all of the facts about what we had experienced. Victor was quiet for a long moment before responding. He said that he had come to the same conclusion, but he had been hoping that his silence could preserve for us the possibility of thinking that our experience had been less dangerous than it actually was. He had been hoping that we could return to our homes and believe that we had encountered something extraordinary, but not genuinely threatening. The missing hiker had changed that calculation. Now the threat seemed real and immediate. Now the creature seemed not to be simply a mysterious inhabitant of the forest, but a genuine danger, a predator that had already claimed a victim. Victor's silence, which might have protected us from unnecessary fear, had instead allowed us to remain in ignorance about our actual level of exposure to danger. I did not know what to say to Victor. I understood his reasoning, but I also understood that he was now tormented by the possibility that his choice had contributed in some way to the missing hiker's fate. I told him this was not logical, that his failure to mention his encounter with the creature could not have influenced whether that hiker encountered it or not. But I could see that logic provided him no comfort. We returned to camp in silence, and the next morning we packed our vehicles for the final time. Our week in the mountains was over. We drove back to our respective homes, carrying with us the weight of our experience and the persistent uncertainty about what we had truly encountered in those Appalachian peaks. The weeks that followed were difficult for all of us in different ways. Judy threw herself into volunteering at a local hiking club, as though the familiarity and community of that endeavor could somehow reassure her that wilderness was safe. Philip maintained contact with Tom Cullen and received regular updates about the investigation into the missing hiker. The case never progressed beyond the initial assessment of accidental loss. No body was ever recovered. No conclusive evidence of what had happened to the man was ever discovered. Megan returned to her normal life, but the experience had affected her athletic pursuits. She found that hiking became difficult, that she felt vulnerable in any wilderness setting, even short hikes on well-established trails. She eventually abandoned outdoor recreation altogether and turned her athletic energy toward indoor pursuits like running on tracks and swimming in pools. Irene continued her photography work, but she no longer sought out wilderness locations. She turned her lens toward urban environments, toward the constructed world of human civilization. And she spoke of this change as though it were a natural evolution of her artistic interests. I understood, however, that it was something more than that. She was avoiding the places where she had learned that the world contained mysteries beyond her ability to photograph and document. Victor struggled the most. The guilt he carried about his silence during that week in the mountains seemed to compound with the knowledge that a man had disappeared in that same region. He eventually sought professional help, speaking with a therapist about his anxiety and his sense of responsibility for an event that he could not have prevented. Over time he improved, but he was never quite the same person who had volunteered to go camping in July. Something in him had been changed by the experience. Some fundamental belief in the safety and predictability of the world had been eroded. As for me, I found myself drawn back to the mountains repeatedly in the months following our expedition. I did not return to the specific location where we had camped. That place remained forbidden territory in my mind. But I returned to other mountain regions, always within established trails and well-traveled areas, always staying close to signs of human civilization. And as I walked those trails, I found myself listening to the sounds of the forest with a different quality of attention. I was no longer simply enjoying the beauty and peace of wilderness. I was listening for that bleat-like sound that Megan had described, the vocalizations that Tom had heard on the night he spent investigating our encounter. I was scanning the boulders I passed for scratches that might indicate the passage of something large and unusual. I was alert to silences in the bird calls, to anything that might suggest the presence of something intelligent watching from beyond the periphery of human sight. 6 months after our camping trip, I received a message from Philip. He had been continuing his informal investigation into the Sheepsquatch phenomenon, and he had learned something new. There had been a series of livestock disappearances on farms near the national forest, more than usual according to local farmers. Tom Cullen believed that the creature might be becoming more active, more willing to venture into human-controlled spaces. It might even be becoming more aggressive in its hunting patterns. Philip asked if I would be interested in organizing another expedition, this time specifically to investigate the Sheepsquatch, rather than simply to enjoy recreational hiking. He said that he felt a responsibility to understand what we had encountered, and that he believed a more focused investigation might yield valuable information about the creature's behavior and habitat. I did not respond to Philip's message immediately. I sat with the proposal for several days, considering what it would mean to deliberately seek out the Sheepsquatch, to walk back into the territory where it lived and hunted and existed as an intelligence beyond the boundaries of scientific classification. Part of me wanted to accept. Part of me wanted to finally understand what I had glimpsed in that clearing in West Virginia. But there was another part of me, a part that had learned something essential from that first encounter, that understood that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The world was larger than we wanted to believe, and it contained things that did not fit into the neat categories we had created. When we ventured into the territory of those things, we risked more than just our physical safety. We risked our entire understanding of how the world worked. I sent Philip a message declining his invitation. I told him that I had learned what I needed to learn, and that I had no desire to return to the forest and risk encountering the Sheepsquatch again. I told him that I thought the creature deserved to exist in peace, away from human observation and investigation, and that our responsibility was to leave it undisturbed. Philip did not respond to my message. But 2 weeks later, I learned through Victor that Philip had organized another expedition, this time with Tom Cullen and a small team of others who were interested in cryptozoology and wilderness research. They had returned to the region of the national forest. I never learned what they discovered on that expedition, whether they found evidence of the Sheepsquatch or whether they simply spent their time searching in the forest without result. What I do know is that the mountains of West Virginia hold secrets that tourists will never discover. They hold creatures and forces that exist beyond the boundaries of our understanding, entities that can be glimpsed only by those fortunate or unfortunate enough to venture into the proper territory at the proper moment. And once you have seen something like that, once you have stood on the edge of a mystery and recognized its reality, you can never quite return to believing that the world is entirely mapped and entirely known. The birds still sing in those mountains. The streams still flow down the valleys. Hikers still arrive in summer to experience the beauty of the Appalachian landscape. But somewhere in the remote areas, in the territories that have not been pacified by human presence, something moves through the darkness. It watches, it observes. It exists in a space between our knowledge and our ignorance, patient and vast and utterly indifferent to whether we believe in its existence or not. I still think about that night when Victor saw it at the edge of our camp, standing on 2 legs, regarding us with an attention that felt almost intelligent. I still listen to the recordings Irene made of the forest sounds during our week in the mountains, searching for something I cannot quite define. And I still have nightmares in which I am walking alone on a forest trail, and I hear that bleat-like sound echoing through the trees, and I know without any doubt that something is moving toward me through the darkness, something large and ancient and entirely outside the boundaries of my understanding. But I do not return to those mountains. I have learned that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some encounters are not meant to be repeated. The Sheepsquatch exists in the West Virginia mountains, and as long as we stay away from its territory and respect its dominion over that remote wilderness, perhaps we can coexist with it in the vast unknown spaces that still remain on the edges of human civilization. Perhaps that is the most important lesson I learned that summer, that the world is not ours entirely, that there are still places where we do not have dominion, and that this fact, which might terrify us, might also be something precious and necessary to preserve. We do not need to understand everything. We do not need to classify and categorize every aspect of nature. Sometimes the most profound wisdom is recognizing what we cannot know and having the sense to leave it undisturbed. The question that has haunted me in the months since that expedition is not what the Sheepsquatch is, but whether it was always watching us before we saw it. How long had it been observing us as we slept and hiked and lived out our week in its territory? How many times had we nearly encountered it without ever knowing how close we were to something that did not fit into our understanding of the world? And now, as I continue my life in the safety of civilization, I sometimes feel that same presence that Judy described, that same weight of attention from something intelligent and alien. I feel it at night when I am alone. I feel it in the darkness at the edges of my vision. And I wonder if by camping in those mountains, by entering the territory of the Sheepsquatch, I brought something back with me. I wonder if that attention, that observational presence, has followed me home. I do not know if this is simply my imagination, a persistence of trauma, or whether the Sheepsquatch has some capacity to reach beyond its territory and to continue observing those who have ventured into its space. What I do know is that I can no longer believe that the world is divided neatly into the mapped and the unmapped, the understood and the incomprehensible. I know that we walk through a world that is far larger and far stranger than we acknowledge, and that the safety we feel in our homes and our cities is an illusion built upon the deliberate forgetting of what lies beyond. The mountains are still out there. The Sheepsquatch is still there, somewhere in the remote valleys and ridges of West Virginia. And the men and women who venture into that territory are taking their lives in their hands, whether they know it or not, because they are walking into a space where the rules we have constructed do not apply, and where mysteries do not yield to our instruments and our logic. The canteen was still warm when I found it, dented aluminum, the kind they stopped making in the 70s, lying on its side against a rotting railroad tie at the mouth of shaft number 9. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, and a tablespoon of black water spilled out across my knuckles. It smelled like copper and something older, something that had no business being liquid. That was the first wrong thing. I need to be honest with you before I go any further. I am not a brave man. I have never claimed to be one. I spent 22 years with the West Virginia Division of Forestry, most of them behind a desk in Beckley, filing timber permits and answering phones from people who thought they saw smoke on a ridge. The closest I ever came to real danger was a copperhead under my truck in 2014. So when I tell you that what happened at the Harlan Seam made me leave public service, leave the state, and leave behind every single thing I thought I understood about the mountains I grew up in, I need you to understand the weight of that. It started with a phone call on June 11th. Alan Ferguson was on the other end. I had known Alan for the better part of 15 years. He was 66 years old, retired from the Bureau of Land Management, and had the kind of quiet authority that made younger men shut up and listen. He was not the type to exaggerate. He was not the type to panic, and he had never once in all the years I had known him called me past 9 at night. It was 11:15 when my phone rang. "Something is wrong up at Harlan Seam," he said. No greeting, no small talk. His voice had a texture I had never heard before, like gravel caught in a drain. "I need you up here. Bring your maps, bring your GPS, and do not, under any circumstances, come alone." I asked him what he meant. He told me that he had been conducting a solo survey of abandoned mine entries along the southeastern ridge of the Appalachian coal belt. A routine job. The Forest Service had flagged 11 sealed shafts for reassessment after a series of subsidence events had opened new fissures in the hillside above the old Harlan mine complex. Alan had volunteered because he knew the terrain. He had hiked those ridges since he was a boy. His grandfather had worked the Harlan Seam in 1948 and had told him stories about the tunnels that Alan carried like stones in his coat pocket, heavy and familiar. He told me he had arrived at the site 3 days earlier. He had mapped 8 of the 11 shaft entries without incident. He had noted the expected structural failures, the collapsed timber frames, the rusted ventilation pipes jutting from the hillside like broken bones, standard decay, standard abandonment. But when he reached shaft number 9, something changed. The seal was broken, not collapsed, not eroded, broken from the inside. The concrete cap that the state had poured in 1971 had been pushed outward in a radial pattern, chunks of it scattered across the clearing in a rough circle. as though something beneath had expanded with tremendous force. Alan said the concrete fragments were coated in a residue he could not identify. It was notite. It was not calcium deposit. It was black. It was slick. And when he touched it, his fingertips went numb for 3 hours. He camped that night a quarter mile from the shaft. He did not sleep. He told me that beginning at approximately 2 in the morning, he heard knocking. Not the kind of knocking you hear when a branch falls against a window. Not the random percussion of loose rock settling in a hollow. This was rhythmic, deliberate, a pattern of 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause of exactly 4 seconds, then 3 more raps. It came from below, from deep below, and it did not stop until dawn. I drove up the next morning. I brought Christina Knight with me. Christina was 43, a geological surveyor contracted through the state, and one of the sharpest minds I had ever worked with. She had spent 9 years mapping subsurface formations across the central Appalachian Basin and had published extensively on methane migration in abandoned coal works. If something geological was happening at Harlan Seam, she would know. We also brought Bruce Gardner. Bruce was 79 years old and had no business being on a mountain, but he was the only living person who had actually worked the Harlan Seam. He had entered those tunnels as a 17-year-old in 1964 and had spent 12 years underground before a roof fall took 3 of his fingers and ended his career. Bruce walked with a cane and breathed with a rattle, but his memory was cathedral sharp. He remembered every drift, every crosscut, every ventilation shaft. He remembered the names of men who had died in those tunnels, and when I told him about the knocking, his face went the color of cold ash. "Tommy Knockers," he said. Just that one word. Then he looked out the window and did not speak again for 40 minutes. I had heard the word before. Every child in West Virginia coal country has. The Tommy Knockers were supposed to be spirits of the mine. Depending on who you asked, they were either the ghosts of dead miners who knocked on tunnel walls to warn the living of danger, or they were something else entirely. Something that had been in the mountains before the mines, before the settlers. Before anyone put a name to the hollows and the ridges and the black veins of coal that ran beneath them like the circulatory system of something vast and sleeping. Bruce Gardner believed the second version. Christina Knight believed neither. She believed in methane pockets, in thermal expansion, in the physics of subterranean acoustics. She believed that abandoned mines produced sounds the way abandoned houses produced shadows, through entirely natural and entirely explainable processes. She said this with confidence as we drove up the switchback road toward the Harlan complex. She said it with slightly less confidence when we parked at the trailhead and found that Alan had built his camp a full mile farther from the shaft than he had originally planned. Alan met us at the tree line. He looked 10 years older than when I had last seen him 2 months prior. His eyes had a hollow quality, a kind of exhausted alertness, like a man who has been watching something he cannot look away from. He shook my hand and nodded to Christina, and then looked at Bruce for a long time without speaking. Something passed between them, some understanding that required no words. Bruce nodded once, slowly, and that was enough. We hiked in together. The trail followed the old coal road, a packed dirt path wide enough for the trucks that had once hauled tonnage down to the rail spur in the valley. The forest had reclaimed most of it. Tulip poplars and red oaks pressed in from both sides, their canopy so dense that the morning light came through in broken coins of gold on the forest floor. It was beautiful. It should have felt peaceful. It did not. Lauren Payne was waiting for us at the site. She was 39, a wildlife biologist with the state, and she had driven up independently after Alan had contacted her about unusual animal behavior he had observed near the shaft. Lauren was methodical, careful, and entirely unimpressed by superstition. She had a clipboard and a pair of binoculars and the particular kind of patience that field work demands. But when we arrived, she was standing at the edge of the clearing with her arms crossed and her clipboard hanging at her side, unused. "There are no animals," she said. That was her greeting. No hello, no handshake, nothing. No squirrels, no chipmunks, no birds. I have been here since dawn and I have not heard a single bird, not one. In a mature hardwood forest in June. She paused and looked back toward the tree line. That does not happen. She was right. It does not happen. A healthy Appalachian forest in summer should be a wall of sound. Warblers, thrushes, woodpeckers, jays, the constant background percussion of insects. But standing in that clearing, listening, I heard nothing. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that has texture, that presses against your eardrums like a held breath. Martin Berry arrived last. He was 55, a retired mine safety inspector, and he brought equipment the rest of us did not have. Gas monitors, ventilation meters, a seismograph that he carried in a pelican case strapped to the frame of a hiking pack that looked older than some of us. Martin was methodical to the point of obsession, the kind of man who measured twice, marked once, and then measured a third time just to be certain. He had inspected over 400 mines during his career. He had crawled into spaces no wider than a coffin lid. He had breathed air so thin it made his vision narrow to a pinhole. He was not afraid of mines, but when he looked at the broken seal on shaft number 9, he set down his pack and said, "That did not happen from gas pressure." Christina asked him how he knew. "Gas pressure blows outward in a cone. The failure pattern radiates from the weakest point in the seal. This," he said, gesturing at the scattered concrete, "is uniform. The force came from every point on the interior surface simultaneously. Equal pressure across the entire face. I have never seen that. Not from methane, not from water, not from anything." We made camp in the clearing. Looking back on it now, that was the first mistake. We should have pulled back. We should have set up a mile out, the way Alan had already learned to do. But the daylight made us brave. The sun was high, and the sky was clear, and the shaft was just a hole in the ground, a relic of an industry that had chewed through these mountains and spat out the bones. There was nothing supernatural about a mine. There was nothing supernatural about concrete that failed under pressure. There was nothing supernatural about silence. That is what I told myself. That is what Christina told herself. That is what we all told ourselves as we set our tents in a semicircle around the dead fire pit that Alan had built and pretended not to notice that Bruce Gardner had positioned his sleeping roll as far from shaft number 9 as the clearing would allow. We ate dinner as the light faded, freeze-dried meals and camp coffee. Alan was quiet. Lauren kept glancing at the tree line. Martin calibrated his instruments with the focus of a man performing surgery. Christina studied her geological maps and made notes in a small field journal. Bruce sat on a folding stool and stared at the shaft with the steady, resigned attention of a man watching a wound he knew would not heal. At 1:47 in the morning, the knocking started. 3 raps. A pause. 3 raps. A pause. 3 raps. I was awake instantly. Not because the sound was loud. It was not. It was muffled, deep, filtered through hundreds of feet of rock and earth and compressed air. But it was unmistakable. It was deliberate. It was patient. And it was coming from directly below us. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the clearing. The fire had died to embers. The sky was cloudless, thick with stars, and the light they cast was cold and insufficient. Alan was already standing. He had a flashlight in one hand and a look on his face that I will never forget. It was not fear exactly. It was the expression of a man whose worst theory has just been confirmed. One by one, the others emerged. Christina stood barefoot on the packed earth and listened with her head tilted, the way a musician listens for a note that is slightly out of tune. Martin had his seismograph up and running within 2 minutes. Lauren held a directional microphone that she had brought for recording owl calls and aimed it at the ground. The knocking continued. 3 and 3 and 3. Perfectly spaced, perfectly consistent. It did not waver. It did not accelerate. It did not diminish. Bruce did not come out of his tent. Martin looked at his seismograph and then looked at me. "The vibrations are not consistent with any natural subsurface activity I have ever recorded," he said. His voice was flat, clinical. He was retreating into data the way some people retreat into prayer. "The frequency is too regular. The amplitude is too uniform. And the source." He paused. "The source is moving." "Moving how?" Christina asked. "Upward," Martin said. "Whatever is producing this is ascending through the shaft at approximately 1 foot every 40 seconds. No one spoke. The knocking continued. 3 and 3 and 3, and in the spaces between the raps, in those 4-second windows of silence, I heard something else. Something that was not knocking. It was breathing. Deep, slow, wet breathing, the sound of air being drawn through a passage that was never meant for air. It came from the shaft, the way steam comes from a vent, rising and spreading and filling the clearing with a presence that had no shape but had undeniable weight. Lauren lowered her microphone. Her hands were steady, but her face had changed. The clinical detachment was gone. In its place was something raw and fundamental. Recognition. Not of a specific thing, but of a category. The recognition that you are in the presence of something that does not belong to any taxonomy you have been trained to understand. "We need to leave," Alan said. It was not a suggestion, but we did not leave. And that was the second mistake, because by the time Martin packed his seismograph and Christina found her boots and Lauren wound her microphone cable and I doused the embers of the fire, the knocking had stopped. And in its place, rising from the open mouth of shaft number 9 like exhalation from a throat of stone, came a sound that was not a sound at all. It was a sensation, a vibration that bypassed the ears entirely and settled in the bones of my chest like a second heartbeat. And then the lights appeared, small, pale, blue-white, like foxfire but mobile, like bioluminescence but deliberate. They drifted upward from the shaft in a loose constellation, a dozen points of cold light that moved with the lazy certainty of embers rising from a fire, except they did not dissipate. They held their shape. They held their positions relative to one another, and they watched us. I know how that sounds. I know that lights do not watch, but I am telling you what I experienced, and what I experienced was the unshakable certainty that those points of light were aware, that they were assessing, that they had risen from whatever depth they called home, specifically because we were here, and they wanted to know what we were. Bruce emerged from his tent then. He looked at the lights, and he did not flinch. He looked at them the way you look at a storm that has been building on the horizon all day and has finally arrived. Expected, dreaded, but expected. "They have been down there since before the coal," he said. His voice was calm, terribly calm. "My grandfather told me, his grandfather told him. The old-timers did not call them Tommyknockers because they thought they were cute. They called them that because when you heard the knocking, it meant they were counting. And when they stopped counting, it meant they were done." "Done with what?" Christina asked. Bruce looked at her with eyes that had seen the inside of the mountain. Eyes that had spent 12 years in lightless corridors where the weight of the world pressed down on wooden beams that creaked and groaned like the ribs of a living thing. "Done deciding who stays," he said. "We should have run. I have played that night over in my mind 10,000 times, and the conclusion is always the same. When the lights appeared above shaft number 9, we should have dropped everything and gone down the coal road in whatever light the stars could give us. We should have accepted the stumbling, the twisted ankles, the branches that would have cut our faces in the gloom. We should have run, but we did not, because something happened that none of us could explain and none of us could resist. The lights, those pale blue-white points that had risen from the shaft like cold sparks from a dead forge, began to move. Not randomly, not erratically. They moved in formation, drifting north across the clearing in a pattern that was almost, but not quite, a straight line. They wove between trees without touching them. They passed through the space where our tent stood without pausing. And they headed toward the old number 2 entry, a secondary shaft that had been sealed in 1969 and had not appeared on any of the reassessment lists because it was, according to every record we had, completely collapsed. Except that it was not. We followed the lights. I cannot tell you why. I cannot tell you what force or compulsion or simple curiosity overrode the screaming alarm in my hindbrain that told me to go the other direction. I can only tell you that we followed. All of us. Even Bruce, who moved through the trees with his cane tapping a slow rhythm against the root-laced ground, his breathing labored, his face set in an expression that was not determination but resignation. He knew, he had always known, and he followed because he understood that some things do not permit refusal. The number 2 entry was 300 yards north of our camp, set into the hillside at a slight upward angle, the way many Appalachian drift mines were built to allow water drainage. The concrete seal that the state had placed 50 years earlier was intact. Unlike shaft number 9, there was no evidence of breach, no scattered debris, no black residue. The seal was whole and smooth and exactly as it had been on the day it was poured, but the lights passed through it. They did not slow. They did not pause. They moved through 6 inches of reinforced concrete the way light passes through glass, without resistance, without distortion, and they vanished into the mountain beyond. For a long moment, the 6 of us stood in the trees at the edge of the entry clearing and stared at the seal. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that is not an absence but a presence, the kind that listens. Then the knocking started again, but this time it was different. It was not the measured 3 and 3 pattern we had heard before. It was faster, irregular, frantic. It came from behind the seal, from deep within the collapsed drift, and it sounded less like a signal and more like a summons. Christina pressed her palm against the concrete. She held it there for 5 seconds, then pulled it away as if she had touched a stove. "It is vibrating," she said. The entire seal, the whole thing is resonating at a frequency I can feel through the bones of my hand." She looked at Martin. "What would cause that?" Martin had his instruments out. He was measuring, he was recording. He was doing what Martin Barry always did when faced with the unexplainable. He quantified it, he put numbers on it. He gave it coordinates and frequencies and decibel levels, as though sufficient data could domesticate whatever was happening. "There is nothing in the published literature that accounts for this," he said. His voice had lost its clinical flatness. There was something underneath it now, a hairline fracture in his professional composure. "The vibration pattern is not mechanical, it is not geological, it is." He stopped. He looked at his readout. He looked at the seal. He looked at the space where the lights had been. "It is biological." "What does that mean?" Lauren asked. "It means that whatever is producing these vibrations is alive." Evelyn Stevens arrived the next morning. I had called her the night before, from the road where I had walked a mile down the ridge to get cell service. Evelyn was 62, a retired mine engineer who had spent 3 decades with the State Division of Mining, and she was the only person I knew who had actual blueprints of the Harlan complex, the original survey maps, the ventilation diagrams, the geological cross-sections that showed every seam, every fault, every pocket of gas and water that the original mining company had identified before they drove the first borehole in 1938. She arrived at dawn in a mud-caked truck with a flatbed full of equipment and a look on her face that told me she had not slept either. Evelyn was a small woman with gray hair cut short and hands that looked like they had been forged rather than grown. She had spent more time underground than anyone I knew except Bruce, and she carried that experience the way a soldier carries combat, not as a badge but as a weight. I told her what we had seen. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she opened a leather portfolio on the tailgate of her truck and spread out the original survey maps of the Harlan mine. "The Harlan complex is not what people think it is," she said. "Everyone thinks it was a simple drift mine, a horizontal entry into a coal seam, open, extract, close. But the Harlan seam was not a normal seam." She traced a line on the map with her finger. "The coal here runs deep, much deeper than the standard Appalachian formation. The original survey in 1938 identified the primary seam at a depth of 600 feet, but below that, the bore samples showed something unusual." "What?" Christina asked. "Voids," Evelyn said, "natural cavities in the limestone substrate, dozens of them, some small, some enormous. The survey team estimated that the largest void was over 300 feet across and at least 120 feet high. They noted that the void system appeared to be interconnected, forming a network that extended laterally for miles beneath the ridge." "That is not unusual," Christina said. "Karst topography produces caves and voids throughout the Appalachian limestone belt." "You are right," Evelyn said, "except for one detail. The survey team noted that the walls of the voids were not limestone. They were coated in a substance they could not identify. They described it as smooth, black, and slightly warm to the touch. They sent samples to the State Geological Lab in Charleston. The lab report, which I have read, states that the substance was not mineral in origin, it was organic." The word settled over the group like a physical thing. Organic, in a cave system 600 feet below the surface of an Appalachian ridge. Organic. "The mining company did not care," Evelyn continued. "They were there for coal. They mined the primary seam and extended drifts laterally along its strike. But in 1952, a crew working the deepest extension of Drift 7 broke through the floor of the seam and dropped into one of the voids." "What happened?" I asked. 3 men went in," Evelyn said. "One came out. He was found 12 hours later at the mouth of the number 4 entry, 3 miles from where the breakthrough occurred. He was naked. His clothes had been removed. His body was covered in the black substance, and he could not speak. Not would not. Could not. The medical report said that his vocal cords appeared to have been fused, sealed together, as though they had been welded shut by something that understood exactly how the human voice works, and wanted to make certain it never worked again." Bruce made a sound then. A small sound, barely audible, like a stone dropped into still water. I looked at him. He was gripping his cane with both hands, the knuckles white, the tendons standing out like cables. "I knew him," Bruce said. "His name was Walter Holt. He was my grandfather's cousin. He lived another 31 years after that night. He never spoke again, but sometimes, late at night, he would sit on his porch and knock on the railing. 3 and 3 and 3, the same pattern, every night, until the day he died. We spent the morning examining the sealed entry of number 2. Martin set up a more comprehensive monitoring station. Christina took core samples from the soil around the perimeter. Lauren conducted a wider survey of the biological silence, walking concentric circles outward from the shaft and noting the exact point at which animal sounds resumed. It was 412 yards from the entry. A perfect circle of silence, as though something had drawn a boundary, and everything with instinct enough to sense it had obeyed. Evelyn studied the blueprints and identified 3 additional access points to the void system. 2 were sealed shafts on the opposite side of the ridge. The third was a natural sinkhole that the survey team had documented in 1938, but that the mining company had never developed. According to Evelyn's maps, the sinkhole dropped 80 feet into a lateral passage that connected to the largest of the voids. "If we want to understand what is happening," Evelyn said, "we need to go down." "No," Bruce said. It was the most forceful I had heard him speak in 2 days. "You do not go into the holes. You never go into the holes." The old-timers knew that. The miners knew that. The things down there, they let you take the coal because the coal was near the surface and they did not care about the surface. But you do not go into their house, you do not knock on their door, and you do not look at them. "What are they?" Lauren asked. Bruce looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the sealed entry. Then he looked at the ground beneath our feet, as though he could see through it, through the soil and the rock and the coal and the limestone, all the way down to where the voids waited in their ancient, patient silence. "They are the mountain," he said. "They have always been the mountain." If you are still listening to this and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I need you to do that now. What I am about to describe in the next part of this account is something I have never told anyone in full, and I need to know that the people hearing it are the people who are choosing to stay. That afternoon, Alan made a decision that would change everything. He decided to descend the sinkhole. His reasoning was clinical. We had an unexplained phenomenon. We had a broken shaft seal. We had anomalous readings. We had a biological silence zone. We had lights that passed through solid concrete. And we had historical precedent, 60 years of reports from miners who had heard the knocking, who had seen the lights, who had entered the voids and come out changed. If there was an explanation, it was below us. The only way to find it was to go down. Christina agreed. Martin agreed. Lauren agreed with reservations. Evelyn agreed because she had spent her career mapping the spaces beneath these mountains, and she had always known there were things in those spaces that the maps did not show. I agreed because I was too far in to turn back, and because some part of me, some reckless and irrational part that I did not know I possessed, needed to see. Bruce refused. He said he would wait at camp. He said he would monitor the radio. He said he would be there when we came back up. He said when in a way that sounded very much like if. We reached the sinkhole at 3:15 in the afternoon. It was exactly where Evelyn's map said it would be. A ragged opening in the forest floor, roughly 12 feet across, rimmed with exposed limestone and choked with fallen branches and decades of accumulated leaf litter. Martin dropped a flare into the opening and we watched it fall. It hit bottom in 4 seconds, 80 feet, give or take. We rigged a static line and went down one at a time. Martin first because he had the gas monitors, then Evelyn because she had the maps, then Christina because she had the geological expertise, then Lauren, then Alan, then me. The bottom of the sinkhole was a rubble field, collapsed limestone, shattered rock, the accumulated debris of centuries of erosion. But at the far end, just as Evelyn's blueprints had indicated, there was an opening. A lateral passage, roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, with smooth walls that gleamed wetly in our headlamp beams. The walls were black, not painted black, not stained black. They were composed of the same substance that the 1938 survey had documented. Smooth, slightly warm, with a texture that was closer to skin than stone. Christina touched the surface and withdrew her hand slowly. She looked at her fingertips. They were clean. The substance had not transferred. "This is not a mineral," she said. She said it quietly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something. "This is not calcium carbonate. This is not calcium sulfate. This is not iron oxide. This is..." She pressed her palm flat against the wall. "This is warm, not from geothermal activity. This is body temperature." The passage extended south for approximately 200 yards, sloping gently downward. Our headlamps threw long beams of white light that seemed to shorten as we progressed, as though the gloom ahead was not merely the absence of light but something denser, something that absorbed it. Martin checked his gas monitors every 50 feet. Oxygen was normal, methane was absent, carbon monoxide was absent, the air was clean. Too clean, he said. In an enclosed subterranean space, you expect some level of gas accumulation, radon at minimum. But the air in this passage was as fresh as the air on the surface. Something was circulating it. Something was breathing. We reached the void at 4:22 in the afternoon. I do not have adequate words for what we saw. I have tried. I have spent years trying. And every attempt falls short because the human language was not built for spaces like this. The passage opened without warning into a chamber of impossible scale. Our headlamps, which had been more than sufficient in the passage, became fireflies in a cathedral. The beams shot outward and upward and simply vanished, swallowed by a volume of space that defied every expectation of what could exist beneath a mountain. The ceiling, if there was one, was beyond the reach of light. The far walls were invisible. The floor dropped away from the passage mouth in a gentle slope of the same smooth black substance, extending outward into a vacancy that felt less like an underground chamber and more like an interior. The interior of something. The air was warm, not hot, not uncomfortable, the exact temperature of living flesh, and it moved, not as a breeze moves, from one direction to another. It pulsed. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that pushed against our skin and pulled back, pushed and pulled, in a pattern that was impossible to mistake for anything other than respiration. The void was breathing. Lauren was the first to say it. "We are inside something," she said. Her voice was very small, not frightened, awed, the voice of someone standing in a space that is too large for the mind to process. "We are not in a cave. We are inside something." And then the lights came, not from above, not from the shaft, from everywhere. The walls of the void began to glow with the same pale blue-white luminescence we had seen at the surface, but now it was not isolated points of light. It was the substance itself. The entire surface of the void, every square foot of that impossible chamber, began to emit a soft, pulsing illumination that was timed exactly to the rhythm of the breathing air. In that light we could see, and what we saw was not empty. The floor of the void was covered in shapes, hundreds of them. Thousands. They were arranged in concentric circles that radiated outward from a central point that was lost in the distance. They were uniform in size, roughly the height and width of a man. They were composed of the same black substance as the walls, and they were moving, not quickly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. They swayed, they pulsed, they expanded and contracted in synchrony with the breathing air and the pulsing light and the pattern of 3 and 3 and 3 that had been echoing through the mountain for as long as anyone could remember. Martin looked at his seismograph. The readings were off the scale, not because the vibrations were violent, but because they were everywhere. Every surface, every molecule of air, every atom of rock was participating in the same harmonic pattern. The mountain was not producing the knocking. The mountain was the knocking, and then the shapes turned toward us, not all at once, sequentially, starting from the nearest ring and propagating outward like a wave. One by one, the shapes oriented in our direction, and the light they emitted shifted from blue-white to something warmer, something that pulsed with a recognition that was older than language, older than thought, older than the coal and the limestone and the mountains themselves. They were looking at us. They were counting us. And they were knocking. 3 and 3 and 3. I will tell you what happened next, and then I will tell you what I believe, and then I will be done. Because I have carried this for too long, and the weight of it is destroying me, and if I do not set it down now, it will take me the way it took Walter Holt. Silent, sealed. Knock, 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 until the end. The shapes moved toward us. They did not walk. They did not crawl. They flowed. The black substance of their bodies shifted and reformed with each movement, maintaining the rough silhouette of a human form but never quite achieving it, as though they were quoting the shape of a person from memory and getting the grammar right but the accent wrong. They moved with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry because it has never encountered anything that could outrun it. Alan grabbed my arm. His grip was crushing. His headlamp beam was shaking because his hands were shaking, and in the stuttering light I could see his face, and on it was an expression I hope I never see on another human being for as long as I live. It was the face of a man who has looked at something that violates the basic architecture of his reality. Not fear, something past fear, something that has no name, because the emotion itself is so rare that the species has never needed a word for it. "Go," he said. "Go now." We turned and ran, all 6 of us, back through the passage, our headlamps bouncing off the smooth black walls, our boots slipping on the warm surface. The air pulsed around us, faster now, as though the breathing had accelerated. The light in the walls flared and dimmed, in a rhythm that matched our footsteps with an accuracy that could not have been coincidence. They were matching our pace, not chasing, matching, keeping exact tempo with our retreat, as though they wanted us to understand that our speed was irrelevant, that the distance we were covering was a courtesy they were extending, not a gap we were earning. We reached the base of the sinkhole in 7 minutes. It had taken us 20 to descend the same distance. Martin went up the rope first, hauling himself hand over hand with a strength I did not know he possessed. Evelyn followed, then Lauren, then Alan. Christina stopped at the base of the rope. She turned and looked back down the passage. The light was still there, pulsing in the walls, advancing slowly and steadily toward the sinkhole, and in the light, the shapes. Closer now, close enough that I could see details I had not seen in the void. Close enough that I could see their faces. They did not have faces, but they had the places where faces should have been. Smooth black surfaces that were shaped like the front of a human head but contained no features, no eyes, no mouths, no expressions. Just the black substance, warm and gently pulsing, and within it, somewhere behind or beneath or beyond the surface, the unmistakable sense of attention, of intelligence, of a consciousness so old and so patient that it had watched species rise and fall like weather patterns and had never once felt the need to intervene, until now. "Christina," I said. "Climb." She climbed. I climbed after her. My arms burned, my lungs burned. The rope bit into my palms and the walls of the sinkhole scraped against my pack, and I did not care. I climbed the way a drowning man swims, without technique, without economy, with nothing but the pure animal imperative to get above, to get away, to put distance between myself and whatever was rising from the bottom of that hole. I cleared the rim and rolled onto the forest floor and lay there gasping. The sky above the canopy was gray. Evening. We had been underground for hours. It had felt like minutes. Martin was on his knees beside the sinkhole, leaning over the edge, his headlamp pointed downward. "They stopped," he said. "They are at the bottom." But they stopped. I looked. The shapes were there, at the base of the sinkhole, standing in their non-standing way on the rubble at the bottom. Their light was dimmer here, muted by the proximity to the surface, as though the open air diluted their luminescence. They were not climbing. They were not trying to climb. They were simply standing, watching, counting, 3 and 3 and 3. The knocking echoed up the sinkhole walls like a pulse in a vein. We ran. We did not discuss it. We did not vote on it. We ran through the forest in the failing light, crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots, following the coal road back toward our camp with the singular focus of animals fleeing a fire. The silence that had surrounded the mine entries had expanded. It was everywhere now. No birds, no insects, no wind in the canopy. Just our breathing and our footsteps, and beneath both, felt rather than heard, the steady, impossible heartbeat of the mountain. We reached camp at 7:42 in the evening. Bruce was sitting on his stool exactly where we had left him. His cane was across his knees. His eyes were on the tree line. He did not ask us what we had found. He looked at our faces and he knew. "They let you leave," he said. Not a question, a statement. "They always let you leave the first time." "The first time?" Evelyn said. She was out of breath. Her hands were trembling. The leather portfolio with the blueprints was pressed against her chest like a shield. "What do you mean the first time?" Bruce looked at her with those old coal miner-as eyes. "I told you about Walter Holt. I told you he went down and came back up. What I did not tell you is what happened after." He shifted on his stool. The cane slid across his knees. "Walter came back up, yes. But every night for the rest of his life, the knocking came to his house. Not from below. From the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, every night. 3 and 3 and 3, and every morning there were marks on his skin. Small round marks, like fingerprints, but too uniform, too precise. As though something was reading him, learning him, translating him into a language he could not speak and could not understand." "Are you saying they followed him?" Christina asked. "I am saying they chose him," Bruce said. "And once they choose you, they do not stop, they do not forget, they simply wait. And when they are done waiting, they come to collect what they counted." We packed the camp in 40 minutes. We took what we could carry and left the rest. We moved down the coal road in a group, flashlights sweeping the trail ahead and behind, and the silence moved with us like a companion, like an escort. Alan was in the lead. He walked with the rigid precision of a man who is using every ounce of his discipline to maintain forward momentum against the gravitational pull of panic. Martin walked beside Evelyn, steadying her on the rough ground. Christina and Lauren walked together, neither speaking, their headlamp beams crossing and recrossing the path ahead. I was at the rear with Bruce, matching his slow, painful pace, listening to his cane tap against the packed earth in a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, 3 and 3 and 3. We were a mile from the trailhead when the lights appeared again. Not from the ground, not from the shaft, from the trees. They were in the canopy. Dozens of them, hundreds, pale blue-white points of cold illumination arranged among the branches of the oaks and poplars, stationary, watching, like the eyes of a congregation looking down from a balcony. The forest, which had been lightless, was now lit from above by a false and terrible sky of phosphorescent attention. We stopped. We could not help it. The lights were above and around and everywhere, and they cast the forest in a pallor that made every shadow look deliberate. Every tree trunk looked like a figure. Every gap between branches looked like a face without features. The knocking started, not from below this time, from all around, from the trees themselves, from the bark and the heartwood and the roots that reached down into the earth and connected to the rock and the coal and the voids where the shapes stood in their ancient patient circles and counted and counted and counted. Alan turned to face the group. His flashlight was pointed at the ground. His face was in shadow. His voice was steady in a way that told me it was costing him everything to keep it so. "We walk," he said. "We do not run. We do not look up. We walk, and we do not stop until we reach the vehicles." We walked. The lights followed. The knocking accompanied us, shifting in position and intensity, sometimes close and sharp, sometimes distant and hollow, but always present. Always 3, always patient. I kept my eyes on the ground. I watched my boots on the trail. I watched the circle of light from my headlamp move across the packed dirt. I did not look up, but I heard Lauren gasp. I heard Evelyn make a sound that was not a word. I heard Martin say, in a voice so carefully controlled it was almost mechanical, "Do not look at them. Whatever they are doing in the trees, do not look at them." I did not look. I did not need to. I could feel it. The shapes had come to the surface. They had risen from the voids through the rock and the earth and the root systems of trees that had grown above them for centuries, and they were among us now, not touching, not threatening, just present, just watching, just counting. We reached the vehicles at 9:18 in the evening. I have never been so grateful for the sight of a parking area in my life. The gravel lot, the wooden post with the faded trailhead sign, the mundane, ordinary ugliness of a Forest Service gate arm. These things, these stupid, unremarkable things, looked like salvation. We loaded the trucks. We drove. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not look at the ridge. I looked at the road and the headlights and the center line, and I drove until the mountains were behind me and the valley opened up and the first streetlights of Beckley appeared on the horizon like a promise. I never went back. None of us did, but it did not matter. Bruce was right. They choose, and once they choose, they do not forget. It has been 3 years since that night. I live in Delaware now. Flat ground, no mountains, no coal, no mines. I live in a ranch house with no basement, and I keep every light on at night, and I sleep, when I sleep, with the television volume up loud enough to drown out the sound of knocking, because it followed me, 3 and 3 and 3, every night, starting at 1:47 in the morning and continuing until dawn. It comes from the walls, from the floor, from the foundation of my house, from the earth beneath the foundation, from whatever is beneath the earth. I have had the foundation inspected. I have had the soil tested. I have had the plumbing examined and the electrical system evaluated and every rational explanation investigated and eliminated. There is nothing wrong with my house. There is nothing beneath my house. There is nothing that could produce a rhythmic knocking pattern at the same time every night, with the same frequency and the same duration and the same terrible patience. And yet, 3 and 3 and 3. I spoke to Alan last month. He hears it too. Different city, different state, same pattern, same time, same 3. He told me he found marks on his arms one morning. Small round impressions, perfectly uniform, arranged in groups of 3. He told me they faded by noon but returned the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Christina will not return my calls. Her number is disconnected. Her university email bounces. The last I heard from anyone who knew her, she had taken a leave of absence and moved to a country without mountains. I do not know which one. I do not know if it matters. Martin is dead. He died 11 months after the Harlan Seam. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But the paramedics who found him told the fire chief, who told a man I know, that Martin was found in his basement, kneeling in front of the wall, his hands pressed flat against the concrete, his face arranged in an expression that was not pain. It was listening. He was listening to something in the wall. Something that was knocking. Lauren contacted me once, 6 months ago. She sent a single email with no subject line. The body of the email contained 4 words. They are still counting. Evelyn Stevens is the one I worry about most. Not because she is frightened, because she is not. Evelyn went back. She told me she went back to the Harlan seam 3 times after that night. She went alone. She went with her blueprints and her equipment, and her unshakable engineer is conviction that there is a rational explanation for everything. The last time she went, she descended the sinkhole by herself. She came back up, but she brought something with her, a sample of the black substance, sealed in a glass jar. She told me she was going to have it analyzed. She told me she was going to find out what it was. She told me that understanding the phenomenon was the only way to stop it. That was 4 months ago. I have not heard from her since. But I received a package last week. No return address, no note, just a small glass jar, sealed with electrical tape, containing a substance that was smooth and black and slightly warm to the touch. I have not opened it. I will not open it. It sits on my kitchen counter and I look at it every morning and every night, and I wonder if the warmth I feel when I hold my palm above the glass is the warmth of geological chemistry or the warmth of something that is alive and has been alive since before, the coal in the mountains and the hollow ancient earth that holds them. Bruce Gardner died peacefully in his sleep 14 months after our trip. He was 80 years old. His daughter told me that he had seemed calm in his final weeks, content even, as though he had made peace with something that had followed him since 1964. She said the only unusual thing was that on the night he died, she heard knocking from his bedroom. 3 raps, a pause, 3 raps, a pause, 3 raps, and then silence, permanent, absolute silence. She said it sounded like a conversation ending, like someone had finally finished a sentence that had taken 60 years to speak. I do not know what the Tommyknockers are. I do not know if they are spirits, or organisms, or geological phenomena, or something so far outside our categories that the question itself is meaningless. I do not know if they are benevolent, or malicious, or something more alien than either of those human words can contain. I do not know why they count. I do not know what the counting means. I do not know what happens when they are done. But I know they are real. I know they are old. I know they are patient. And I know that once they have counted you, once those 3 careful raps have sounded in the walls of your house and the bones of your chest and the silence between your thoughts, they do not stop, they do not forget. They are the mountain, and the mountain has a memory that makes ours look like breath on glass. It is 1:43 in the morning as I finish writing this. In 4 minutes, the knocking will start. It will come from beneath the floor. It will be measured and precise and perfectly, terribly patient. 3 and 3 and 3. And I will lie in bed and listen and wonder if tonight is the night they finish counting. If tonight is the night the knocking stops and the silence comes and whatever has been reading me for 3 years finally translates the last word and closes the book. I do not know. I will not know until it happens. But I will tell you this. If you ever find yourself in the mountains of West Virginia, walking the old coal roads where the timber frames rot and the ventilation pipes rust and the sealed shafts stand like tombstones for an industry that ate the earth and called it progress, listen. Listen carefully. Listen past the birds and the wind and the creek water and the comfortable sounds that tell you the forest is alive and well and ordinary. Listen for the silence. Listen for the space where the birds should be singing and are not. Listen for the gap in the noise of the living world. And if you hear knocking, 3 careful raps followed by a pause, followed by 3 more, do not investigate, do not approach, do not shine your light into the shaft, do not press your hand against the seal, do not ask what is down there, because they are not knocking to warn you, they are knocking to count you, and once they have your number, the mountain never lets go. The summer I turned 59 was supposed to be the summer I finally slowed down. That is what my physician told me. That is what my ex-wife told me, and that is what the ache in my left knee told me every single morning when I swung my legs off the side of the bed. But Terry George does not slow down. Terry George doubles down. And when Craig Larson called me in the middle of May with that big voice of his, booming through the phone like he was standing in a canyon and wanted the whole ridge to hear, I knew that slowing down was not going to happen that year either. Craig had a plan. He always had a plan. 46 years old and still built like a man who could drag a buck out of a hollow without breaking stride. He had found a stretch of backcountry deep in the Pine Mountain corridor of southeastern Kentucky, a tract of reclaimed mining land that had been left alone long enough for the forest to swallow it back whole. According to Craig, the property bordered a section of state wilderness that had not seen a maintained trail in over a decade. No cell service, no paved roads within 11 miles. Just old logging cuts choked with laurel thicket, sandstone bluffs stacked along narrow creek beds, and ridgelines that fell away into valleys so deep and so quiet that you could hear your own heartbeat bouncing off the fog. He wanted a week out there. Camping, hiking, maybe some fishing in the feeder creeks if we could find water clear enough. He had already talked to Keith Dean, who at 74 was the oldest among us and the most stubborn man alive when it came to refusing a chair. Keith had been walking these mountains since before interstate highways cut through them, and he told Craig he knew the area. Said his grandfather had hunted that same ridge before the coal companies turned it inside out. Keith did not move fast anymore, but he moved with the certainty of a man who had already outlived everything the hills had thrown at him, or so he believed. Craig had also roped in Joan Hansen, which surprised me. Joan was 68, and she was not what anyone would call outdoorsy in the traditional sense. She was a retired county librarian from Hazard who had spent her career surrounded by books and silence, but she had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and she had been doing volunteer trail surveys for a conservation group for the last few years. She knew the flora, she knew the geology, and she had a way of reading a landscape the way most people read a newspaper, scanning it quickly and pulling out the details that mattered. I liked Joan. She did not waste words, and in the mountains that is a quality worth more than any piece of gear. Then there was Danielle Johnston, 34, the youngest of us by a wide margin. She was Craig's neighbor's daughter, a wildlife biologist who worked seasonal contracts for the state, running camera trap surveys for black bear and bobcat populations across the Daniel Boone National Forest. Danielle had the kind of quiet competence that made you forget she was half the age of most of the group. She carried her own weight and then some, and she had a way of watching the tree line that told me she had spent more nights alone in the woods than most people spend in their own living rooms. The last to confirm was Ann Chapman, 53. A middle school science teacher from Whitesburg who had been Craig's hiking partner on and off for nearly 15 years. Ann was steady. That is the word I always come back to when I think about her. She was not the fastest or the strongest, but she was the person you wanted next to you when things went sideways, because Ann Chapman did not panic. She assessed, she adapted, she moved forward. I had seen her reset a dislocated finger on a trail in the Red River Gorge without making a sound louder than a slow exhale through her nose. We gathered at a gas station in Whitesburg on a Thursday morning in late June. The air was already thick and wet, the kind of humidity that sits on your skin like a second shirt and never dries. Craig had his truck loaded with gear. Keith arrived in a rusted Ford Ranger that looked like it had been rolling through these hollows since the Reagan administration. Joan rode with Ann in a Subaru that smelled like pine sap and old field guides. Danielle pulled up last in a state vehicle she was not technically supposed to be using for personal trips, but nobody said anything about it. We drove south on Route 119, then turned off onto a series of increasingly narrow roads that degraded from asphalt to gravel to packed dirt to something that could barely be called a road at all. The last 4 miles were a logging track so overgrown that Craig had to stop twice to drag fallen branches out of the way. The canopy closed over us like a tunnel, tulip poplars and white oaks so tall and so thick that the light filtering through them turned everything below into a green twilight. I remember thinking that it felt like driving into a mouth. We parked at a wide spot where the track dead-ended against a wall of rhododendron. From there it was a 2-mile hike to the spot Craig had chosen for base camp. A flat bench of ground on the shoulder of a ridge overlooking a creek that the topographic map labeled as Wolfpen Branch. The name did not bother me at the time. Every other creek in eastern Kentucky has a name like that. Wolfpen, Panther, Bear Wallow, they are just names. Remnants of a time when the animals those names referenced were still common enough to warrant the warning. We set up camp in the long golden light of a June evening. 3 tents arranged in a loose triangle around a fire ring Craig built from creek stones. Keith and Joan each had their own shelter. Craig and Ann shared one. Danielle and I took the third, though we kept a respectful distance inside it. Sleeping bags on opposite sides with our packs between us like a wall. The creek was maybe 40 yards downhill, and the sound of it filled the campsite with a constant low murmur that was pleasant at first, and then, later, became something else entirely. Because when you are listening for sounds in the night, running water is the enemy. It masks everything. It fills the silence with a noise that your brain learns to subtract. And in that subtraction, in that false quiet, things can move very close to you without being heard. The first evening was uneventful, in the way that first evenings in the backcountry always are. We cooked over the fire. Keith told stories about his grandfather running hounds through these ridges in the 1950s. Joan identified 7 species of fern within 20 feet of camp and seemed genuinely delighted by each one. Danielle walked the perimeter with a headlamp, checking for game trails and scat. Anne sat on a log and sharpened her knife with slow, measured strokes that sounded like a whisper repeating itself. Craig stood at the edge of the ridge and looked out over the valley below, where fog was already pooling in the low places like milk poured into a bowl. I should have paid more attention to what Danielle found that first night. She came back from her perimeter walk with a look on her face that I did not recognize at the time but have since come to understand as professional alarm disguised as curiosity. She told us she had found a game trail about 60 yards north of camp that had been used recently and heavily. The tracks were deep and widely spaced, pressed into soft ground near a seep spring. She said they were unusual. When Craig asked her what she meant by unusual, she paused for a moment and then said that the stride length did not match anything she would expect to find in this area. Not bear, not deer, not boar. Keith laughed and said it was probably a big cat. Said there had always been mountain lions in these hills, no matter what the wildlife agencies claimed. Danielle did not argue with him, but she did not agree either. She just put her headlamp back in her pack and said she would take another look in the morning when the light was better. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the creek and the wind moving through the canopy above us and the occasional pop of a dying ember in the fire ring. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard something else. It was distant, maybe a quarter mile away, maybe more. It was hard to judge distance in those valleys where sound bounces off the rock walls and folds back on itself. It was a vocalization. Not a howl, not a scream. Something between the two that rose in pitch and then dropped abruptly, like a voice that had been cut off mid-sentence. I lay there and waited for it to repeat, but it did not come again. In the morning I asked if anyone else had heard it. Keith said he had. He was sitting by the fire with a tin cup of coffee, his face unreadable behind that white beard of his, and he said he had heard it clearly. He said it sounded like something big and something unhappy. When I asked him if he had ever heard anything like it before, he took a long sip of his coffee and looked out at the tree line and said one word, once. He did not elaborate, and I did not press him. That was a mistake. I know that now. If I had pressed Keith Dean that morning, if I had made him tell me what he knew, what he had heard before and where and what had happened after, I believe things would have gone differently. I believe we would have packed up that camp and driven back to Whitesburg and spent the rest of the week in a motel eating gas station food and complaining about the heat. And that would have been fine. That would have been more than fine. But I did not press him. And we stayed. The second day began with fog so dense that you could not see the trees on the far side of camp. It was not the kind of fog that burns off by mid-morning. It was the kind that clings to the hollows and refuses to leave. The kind that turns the forest into a series of gray rooms separated by walls you cannot see through. Joan said it was typical for the elevation. Danielle said it was good for tracking because the moisture would hold prints in the soil. Craig said it meant we should stay together. We decided to hike north along the ridge, following the contour toward a point on the map where 2 drainages converged into a larger creek that Keith said used to hold native brook trout. The plan was to fish there for a few hours, then loop back to camp along the opposite side of the drainage. A 6-mile circuit that Craig estimated would take us most of the day if we moved at Keith's pace, which was deliberate and unapologetic. The trail, such as it was, followed an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. The roadbed was still visible as a shallow depression in the ground, wider than a game trail but narrower than anything a vehicle could use now. Saplings had punched through the gravel. Fallen logs crossed it at random intervals. In places, the laurel had grown so thick on both sides that we had to turn sideways to push through, the waxy leaves scraping against our arms and faces with a sound like fingers dragging across wet fabric. Danielle was in the lead. She stopped about a mile in and crouched down without saying anything. I was directly behind her, and I saw what she was looking at before she pointed it out. There was a footprint in the mud at the edge of a small puddle where rainwater had collected in a rut. It was not a boot print, it was not a bear print, it was something I had never seen before and have not seen since, and I have spent the better part of 3 decades walking through wild country. The print was roughly 14 inches long. It had 5 toes, broad and splayed, with what appeared to be claw marks extending about an inch beyond the toe pads. The heel was wide and deep, pressed into the mud with a force that suggested significant weight. The stride, measured from that print to the next one visible about 4 feet ahead, was enormous. Danielle pulled a tape measure from her vest and laid it along the length of the print without touching the impression itself. She did not say the measurement out loud. She just looked at it, then looked at me, and I could see something in her eyes that I had not seen there before. Craig came up behind us and looked over our shoulders and said what we were all thinking but none of us wanted to say out loud. He said it looked like a primate track, a large primate. Danielle told him that was not possible. There are no wild primates in North America outside of humans. Craig said he knew that. Then he asked her what else could make a print like that, and she did not have an answer. Keith arrived last, breathing hard from the climb. He leaned on his walking stick and looked down at the print for a long time. His face changed. I watched it happen. The color did not drain out of it all at once. It left slowly, like water soaking into sand, starting at his forehead and moving down until his whole face had taken on the color of old paper. He straightened up and looked north along the trail, into the fog, and then he turned around and looked south, back the way we had come. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I had ever heard it. He said we should not be here. Joan asked him what he meant. Keith looked at her with an expression I can only describe as grief mixed with something older and less nameable, and he told us a story. He said his grandfather had hunted this ridge in 1952 with 2 other men from Letcher County. They had been tracking a black bear that had been getting into livestock pens in the valley below. They followed it up here, into this same drainage, and they found tracks like these. His grandfather told him that the tracks led them to a clearing where something had torn a full-grown white-tailed deer apart. Not eaten it, torn it apart. The pieces were scattered across an area the size of a basketball court, and some of them were hanging in the lower branches of the surrounding trees, draped over limbs 8 and 9 feet off the ground. His grandfather and the 2 other men left the ridge that same day and never came back. His grandfather never talked about what he thought had made those tracks, but he told Keith 2 things that Keith remembered for the rest of his life. The first was that some hollows in these mountains are not empty. The second was that what lives in them is not interested in being found, and that the worst thing you can do is let it know you are looking. Craig was quiet for a moment after Keith finished. Then he said something that I wish he had not said. He said that was a good story, but stories are not evidence. He said the print could be a deformity in a bear track, or an old print that had been distorted by water and erosion. He said we had 6 days of supplies and he was not going to cut the trip short because of a footprint and a campfire tale. Anne put her hand on Craig's arm and said maybe we should at least modify the route. Stay on the ridgeline instead of dropping down into the drainage. Keep to higher ground where the visibility was better. Craig agreed to that, and we continued north, but the mood had changed. The fog did not help. It pressed against us from all sides, muffling sound and limiting sight to maybe 30 yards in any direction. The trees appeared and disappeared around us like figures stepping in and out of a doorway. We reached the confluence around midday. The fog had thinned slightly at the lower elevation, but the creek bottom felt enclosed, the walls of the drainage rising steeply on both sides and funneling everything, sound, light, air, into a narrow corridor that made me feel observed. Craig and Anne rigged their fishing rods and moved downstream. Keith sat on a boulder and ate a sandwich. Joan collected plant samples in small plastic bags, labeling each one with a marker in handwriting so precise it looked printed. Danielle and I walked upstream to scout. That is when we found the tree. It was a mature red oak, maybe 18 inches in diameter, standing about 40 yards upstream from the others. The bark had been stripped from it in long vertical gouges that started at about 5 feet off the ground and extended up to at least 9 feet. The exposed wood underneath was pale and raw, and the gouges were deep, some of them penetrating nearly an inch into the sapwood. Danielle examined them closely. She ran her fingers along the edges of the marks and then pulled her hand back as if the wood were hot. She told me they were claw marks, not bear. Bear claw marks on trees are typically 4 parallel lines, spaced about 2 inches apart, made when the animal climbs or reaches up to mark territory. These were different. There were 5 marks in each set, spaced about 3 inches apart, and they had been made with a dragging downward motion, as if whatever had made them had reached up as high as it could and then pulled down with tremendous force. The wood fibers at the bottom of each gouge were torn, not cut, shredded, like something had tried to peel the tree open. I looked at the ground around the base of the oak. The leaf litter had been disturbed in a wide circle, pushed outward from the trunk as if something heavy had been standing there and shifting its weight. I found 2 more prints in the exposed soil, matching the ones we had seen on the trail. Danielle photographed them with a camera she kept in her vest, taking multiple angles and placing her hand next to them for scale. Neither of us said anything for a while. We just stood there in the gray light, with the sound of the creek behind us, and the stripped tree in front of us, and the knowledge, unspoken but shared, that something large and powerful and unknown was using this drainage. Something that walked on 2 legs and had hands, or something very much like hands. Something that was strong enough to gouge solid oak with its bare grip. We went back to the group. Danielle showed Craig the photographs on her camera. He looked at them, and I watched his jaw tighten, but he did not say anything about leaving. What he said was that we should get back to camp before the light started to fade and make sure we hung our food bags properly and kept the fire going through the night. The hike back was faster than the hike out. Nobody said much. The fog had returned to full density, and the forest around us felt compressed, as if the trees had moved closer together while we were not looking. I stayed near the back of the group with Keith, who was moving slower than he had that morning. His breathing was labored, but I do not think it was from exertion. I think he was afraid. I had known Keith Dean for 20 years, and I had never seen him afraid of anything. Watching him walk through that fog with his head turning every few seconds to check behind us was more unsettling to me than the footprints or the tree or the sounds in the night. We reached camp with about an hour of light left. Craig and Danielle hung the food bags from a line strung between 2 trees, high enough and far enough from the trunks that nothing could reach them without climbing. Anne rebuilt the fire and kept it large, larger than we needed for warmth. Joan sat in the entrance of her tent and wrote in a small notebook she carried everywhere, filling page after page with her careful handwriting. I asked her what she was writing. She looked up at me with an expression that was not quite a smile and said she was documenting everything because she had a feeling that when this was over, someone was going to want to know exactly what happened and in what order. That was the night everything changed. It started around 11. The fire had burned down to a wide bed of coals that threw an orange glow across the campsite but did not reach the trees. The canopy above us was a solid ceiling of black where no stars were visible. The creek was doing its constant work of filling the air with sound that meant nothing, masking everything behind a curtain of white noise. Craig was sitting up by the fire. He had volunteered for first watch, though nobody had explicitly agreed that watches were necessary. He was just sitting there when I heard him make a small sound, a quick inhale through his nose, the kind of sound you make when you see something unexpected and your body reacts before your brain does. I sat up in my tent and looked toward the fire. Craig was standing now, facing north, toward the tree line beyond the food bags. He had his headlamp on, but he had not turned it to full power. The beam was a dim yellow cone pointed at the ground in front of him. He was not moving. I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The air was cool and damp and tasted like smoke and wet earth. I walked to where Craig was standing, and I followed his gaze into the trees. There was something there. It was standing about 50 yards from camp, just at the edge of where the firelight failed and the gloom of the forest took over completely. It was upright, it was tall, and it was watching us. I could not make out details. It was a shape, a silhouette that was slightly less black than the blackness behind it, but it had a form, and that form was wrong. The proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too wide for the height, or the height was too great for the shoulders. I could not tell which because my sense of scale had abandoned me entirely. It did not move. It did not make a sound. It simply stood there, at the boundary between our light and its world, and it watched. Craig raised his headlamp slowly and clicked it to full power. The beam cut through the humid air like a white blade and reached the tree line and struck the spot where the shape had been. Nothing. The space between the trunks was empty. Just hemlock and rhododendron and the blank gray wall of fog beyond. Craig kept the beam on the spot for a long time. Then he lowered it and looked at me, And for the first time since I had known him, Craig Larson had nothing to say. Nobody slept after that. We gathered around the fire and Craig told the others what we had seen, and I confirmed it. And then the discussion began. It was not an argument. It was worse than an argument. It was 6 people who all knew what the right decision was but could not agree on when to make it. Anne said we should leave at first light. Just pack the essentials, leave the rest, and hike the 2 miles back to the vehicles and drive out. Joan agreed. Keith said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. The silence of a man who had already made his decision and was just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Danielle was the only one who hesitated, and I could see the conflict in her face. The part of her that was a trained field researcher wanting to stay and observe and document warring with the part of her that was a human being standing in the proximity of something that did not belong in any field guide she had ever read. Craig was the problem. Craig was always the problem in situations like this, because Craig Larson measured his life in the things he did not walk away from. He said we had not been threatened. He said whatever was out there had kept its distance. He said that leaving now would mean hauling all the gear back in the fog through 2 miles of overgrown trail in conditions where someone could easily twist an ankle or worse. He said we should wait until full daylight and then make a decision based on what we could see clearly. I understood his logic. I even agreed with parts of it, but logic is a poor companion in the backcountry when the night is pressing against you from all sides and you have just seen something standing at the edge of your campfire that your brain cannot categorize or explain. Logic is for daylight and paved roads and rooms with locks on the doors. Out here, in the lightless hollows of Pine Mountain, with the fog sitting on us like a weight and the creek erasing every sound that might have warned us of approach, logic felt like a language we no longer spoke. We compromised. We would stay until dawn, then reassess. In the meantime, we would keep the fire high and keep watches in pairs. Craig and Anne took the first shift. Danielle and I took the second. Keith and Joan would take the third, carrying us through to sunrise. I did not go back to my tent during Craig and Anne's watch. I sat on a log near the fire, with my back to the flames so my eyes could adjust to the gloom beyond the light, and I watched the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was absolutely still, which was wrong. A forest in late June should be alive with sound, insects, owls, the rustle of small mammals in the leaf litter. There should be a continuous low orchestra of living things going about their business in the night. But there was nothing. Just the creek, and the fire, and the breathing of 6 people who were trying very hard not to look as frightened as they were. Danielle sat beside me when our watch began. She had her camera in her lap and a canister of bear spray in her right hand. I asked her if she thought bear spray would work on whatever was out there. She said she did not know, but it was the heaviest deterrent she had, and holding it made her feel slightly less like prey. That word hit me in a way I was not prepared for. Prey. I had spent my entire adult life walking through wild country, and I had never once felt like prey. I had been nervous. I had been cautious. I had been respectful of the things that lived in these mountains and the damage they could do. But I had never felt hunted. I had never felt watched by something that was evaluating me, measuring me, deciding whether I was worth the effort. And sitting there in the glow of that fire with Danielle Johnston and her bear spray, that is exactly how I felt. Around 3 in the morning, the smell arrived. It came from the north, carried on a breath of air so faint that the flames barely flickered. It was organic and overpowering, a thick, musky stench that coated the inside of my nostrils and clung to the back of my throat. It was not the smell of a dead animal, though there was something of decay in it. It was not the smell of a bear, though it carried a similar heaviness. It was something distinct, something I had no reference for. It smelled like earth and sweat and something glandular and hot, like the scent of a living body pushed to its physical limits, but amplified 100 times. Danielle smelled it too. Her hand tightened on the bear spray, and she stood up slowly, scanning the tree line. I stood with her. The fire was at our backs, and the forest was in front of us, and the smell was getting stronger. Then we heard it. Not the vocalization from the first night. This was different. This was close. This was a sound like a large branch being broken slowly and deliberately, the fibers separating with a sustained, wet cracking noise that went on for 3 or 4 seconds and then stopped. Then another one. Same sound. Same duration. Coming from the same direction, the north side of camp, but closer than before. Craig was out of his tent in seconds. Anne was right behind him. Keith emerged last, moving stiffly, his walking stick in one hand and a hatchet in the other. Joan stayed in her tent, but I could see the light from her headlamp through the fabric. She was sitting up and listening. Craig turned his headlamp to full power and swept the beam across the tree line in a slow arc from east to west. The light caught the trunks of the hemlocks and the waxy leaves of the rhododendron and the gray ribbons of fog that threaded between them like something alive. And then the beam stopped, and Craig said a word that I will not repeat here. And for one full second, maybe two, I saw it. It was standing behind a hemlock, partially obscured by the trunk, but enough of it was visible to give me an impression that has not faded in the years since, and will not fade for whatever years I have left. It was tall, not tall the way a very large man is tall. Tall the way a thing is tall when it has no business being that height, and yet there it is, standing in front of you, forcing your sense of proportion to recalibrate in real time. I estimate it was between 7 and 8 feet, though I acknowledge that estimates made in firelight and fog and terror are unreliable. Its body was broad, heavily built, covered in what appeared to be coarse hair that was matted and uneven, hanging from its frame in patches and clumps. The color was difficult to determine. It seemed to shift between grayish-brown and something close to charcoal, depending on how the light struck it. The face is what I remember most clearly, and the face is what I have the most difficulty describing. It was not an ape face. It was not a human face. It was something that existed in the space between those two categories. A face that borrowed features from both and combined them into something that should not have been coherent but was. The brow was heavy and protruding, shadowing the eyes so deeply that I could not see the eyes themselves, only the faint wet glint of reflected firelight where the eyes should have been. The nose was flat and wide. The jaw was massive, squared, jutting forward slightly in a way that made the mouth seem enormous. And the mouth was partially open, revealing teeth that were not uniform, that were crowded and worn and too large for the jaw that held them. It looked at us. I felt it look at us the way you feel a hand on your shoulder, a physical sensation that registered somewhere deeper than sight. And then it did something that broke something inside me that I do not think has ever been fully repaired. It tilted its head, not the way a curious animal tilts its head, not the way a dog does it, or a bird. It tilted its head the way a person does when they are studying something they do not quite understand, a slow, deliberate rotation to one side that communicated intelligence and evaluation and patience. It was assessing us. It was deciding. Craig did not move. Anne had her hand on his arm, and she was gripping it so tightly that I could see the tendon standing out on the back of her hand even from where I was standing. Danielle raised the bear spray. Keith stood beside me with his hatchet, breathing in short, shallow gasps that sounded like paper tearing. The creature, and I will call it a creature, because I have no better word, and because the word monster implies a fiction that this was not, looked at us for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it moved. It stepped back behind the hemlock trunk and was gone. Not in the way an animal retreats, with the rustle and crash of a body moving through brush. It was simply no longer visible. The space it had occupied was empty, and the only evidence that it had been there at all was the smell, which lingered like a stain in the air, and the sound of something heavy moving through the forest to the north, each footfall landing with a muffled thud that I could feel through the soles of my boots. Nobody spoke for a long time. Joan was the first. She unzipped her tent and stepped out and looked at our faces and said, very calmly, that she assumed we were leaving now. It was not a question. Craig opened his mouth and then closed it and then nodded, and in that nod I saw something I had never seen in him before, which was the acceptance that there were forces in this world that did not care about his stubbornness or his plans or his refusal to walk away. We packed. We packed in the near total absence of light, working by headlamp and by the glow of a fire that nobody tended and nobody put out. We left things behind, cooking gear, the food bags still hanging from their line, a folding chair that Keith had carried in on his back and would not be carrying out. We took our tents and our sleeping bags and our packs, and we left everything else, and we moved. The hike back to the vehicles was 2 miles. In daylight, on flat ground, 2 miles is nothing. In the lightless hours before dawn, on a trail that was barely a trail, through fog so thick it turned our headlamp beams into solid white cones that illuminated nothing beyond their own light. 2 miles felt like 20. We moved in a tight column, Craig in front, Danielle behind him, then Anne, then Joan, then me, then Keith at the rear, which I did not like, because Keith was the slowest and the oldest and the most vulnerable. But he refused to move from that position. He said someone needed to watch behind us, and since he could not move fast enough to be useful at the front, he would make himself useful at the back. I walked with my head on a swivel, checking the forest on both sides and glancing back at Keith every few seconds. The trees slid past us in the fog like the columns of an enormous ruined building, appearing and disappearing at the edge of our light with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The ground was uneven and slick with dew. Anne stumbled once and caught herself on Danielle's pack. Joan moved with a steadiness that seemed almost supernatural for a woman her age, placing each foot with precision, never looking down, her eyes fixed on something in front of her that the rest of us could not see. We were about a mile from the vehicles when Keith made a sound behind me. Not a word, just a sound, a low guttural exhalation that was half gasp and half groan, the kind of noise a man makes when he has been hit in the stomach and is trying not to fall. I turned around and Keith was stopped on the trail, his walking stick planted in the ground, his body rigid. He was looking to our left, into the hollow below the trail, where the slope dropped away steeply into a creek bottom that was invisible in the fog. I followed his gaze. I turned my headlamp in the direction he was looking, and I saw movement. Not the creature, not directly. What I saw was the fog itself being disturbed, pushed aside in a long, continuous wave, as if something very large was moving through the hollow below us and below the level of our sight, displacing the fog the way a ship displaces water. The wave moved parallel to us, matching our pace, and then it accelerated, moving ahead of us along the hollow, and then it stopped. Keith looked at me. His eyes were wet, not from tears, from the fog. Or maybe from tears, I do not know, he said, in a voice so quiet I had to lean toward him to hear it, that it was pacing us, that it had been pacing us since we left camp, that it knew where we were going, and it was deciding whether to let us get there. We moved faster after that, not running. You cannot run on a trail like that in those conditions without someone getting hurt. But we moved as fast as Keith could manage, which was faster than I had thought possible for a man of 74 with bad knees and a heart that had already survived one surgery. Adrenaline is a remarkable compound. It erases limitations that you have lived with for years and replaces them with a single burning imperative. Move. Just move. The last half mile was the worst. The trail dropped down through a section of laurel so dense that we had to push through it single file, the branches closing behind each person like a curtain. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The sound of our movement through the brush was loud, loud enough to mask anything that might have been following us, and that was its own kind of terror, the not knowing, the awareness that the noise of your own escape is the thing preventing you from hearing what you are escaping from. And then the vehicles appeared. Craig's truck, Keith's Ranger, and Subaru, Danielle's borrowed state vehicle. They materialized out of the fog like artifacts from another world, a world of roads and engines and locks and walls, and I have never in my life been so grateful to see machines made of metal and glass. We loaded the vehicles without speaking. Craig threw his pack into the bed of his truck and got behind the wheel and started the engine, and the sound of it, that mechanical growl of combustion, was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Danielle climbed in beside him. Anne and Joan got into the Subaru. I helped Keith into his Ranger and then got in on the passenger side because I was not going to let him drive alone, not in his condition, not after what we had seen. We drove out. The logging track was narrow and rough, and the vehicles lurched and bounced over the ruts and the roots and the stones, and the branches scraped along the sides of the trucks like fingers trying to hold us back. And I kept my eyes on the side mirrors the entire time, watching the trail behind us disappear into the fog, watching for something that I prayed would not appear but half expected to see standing in the middle of the track, watching us leave. It did not appear. We reached the gravel road, then the paved road, then Route 119, where other vehicles were moving, ordinary people driving to ordinary jobs in an ordinary world that had no room in it for what we had experienced. Keith drove with both hands on the wheel, and his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping under the skin of his cheeks. He did not say a word until we reached Whitesburg, and then he pulled into the same gas station where we had gathered 2 days earlier and turned off the engine and sat there for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said something that I have thought about every single day since. He said his grandfather had a name for it. The people in these hollows had a name for it that went back long before the coal companies, long before the highways, long before any of the things that modern people used to convince themselves that the world had been mapped and measured and fully understood. They called it the hillbilly beast. Not because it was a hillbilly, because it lived in the hills, and the hills were where it had always lived, and the hills were where it would continue to live long after every one of us was gone. Keith Dean died 14 months later, heart failure. He was 75. I went to his funeral in a small church in Letcher County, and I sat in the back pew and I listened to people talk about what a strong man he had been, what a capable man, and I thought about the way his face had looked in the firelight when he saw that print in the mud, the color leaving it like water leaving a basin. I thought about how something that had survived for hundreds or maybe thousands of years in the forgotten hollows of the Appalachian Mountains had finally broken something inside a man who had spent his entire life believing that the mountains had no secrets left to give. Joan Hansen published an article the following year in a small regional journal about unusual wildlife sign in the Pine Mountain corridor. It was carefully written and meticulously documented, and it said nothing about what she actually saw. She told me on the phone that she had written the truth and then deleted it because she knew that no one would believe it and that publishing it would destroy her credibility and accomplish nothing. She said the truth was in her notebook, and she kept that notebook in a locked drawer in her desk, and she would leave instructions for it to be opened after her death. Danielle Johnston transferred to a position in Montana the following spring. She told Craig she needed a change of scenery. She told me, in a conversation we had on the phone late one evening, that she could not go back into the forests of eastern Kentucky without feeling watched. She said that her training had given her a framework for understanding the natural world, and that framework had a hole in it now, a hole shaped exactly like the thing we had seen behind that hemlock tree, and she did not know how to repair it. Craig Larson never talked about it, not to me, not to Anne, not to anyone as far as I know. He went back to his life and his routines and his plans, and when I brought it up once at a barbecue at his house, he looked at me with an expression that was not anger and was not denial, but was something more like a door closing. And he said that some things do not benefit from discussion. Ann Chapman told me she still hikes. She still goes into the mountains and walks the trails and sleeps under the stars. But she does not go to Pine Mountain. She does not go anywhere near that drainage or that ridge or that hollow. And she carries a firearm now, which she never did before, not because she thinks a firearm would stop what we saw, but because holding it makes her feel slightly less like prey. If you are still listening to this, I need you to understand something. I do not tell this story to frighten you. I do not tell it to convince you. I do not tell it because I want attention or sympathy or validation. I tell it because it happened. Every detail I have described occurred exactly as I have described it. The prints were real. The claw marks were real. The smell was real. The shape at the edge of the firelight was real. The face behind that hemlock, with its heavy brow and its massive jaw and its patient, tilted evaluation of 6 human beings who had wandered into a place where they did not belong, was real. If you have ever walked into the deep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, the ones where the logging roads have been swallowed and the creek names on the maps do not match anything the locals call them, if you have ever stood in one of those places and felt a stillness that was not peaceful but expectant, as if the forest itself was holding its breath and waiting for you to understand something that you were not yet ready to understand, then you know what I am talking about. And if you have not, then I envy you. I envy the simplicity of a world where the mountains are just mountains, and the fog is just fog, and the sounds you hear at 2 in the morning are just the ordinary complaints of an ordinary forest settling into an ordinary night. I do not live in that world anymore. I have not lived in it since that June in the Pine Mountain wilderness of Kentucky, when 6 people walked into a hollow that should have been empty and discovered that it was not, that it had never been empty, that the thing living in it had been there longer than any of us, longer than the logging roads, longer than the coal mines, longer than the towns in the valleys below, and that it would be there long after every last trace of our presence had been erased from the ridge. The mountains remember. The hollows keep their own counsel. And the thing that walks through them on 2 legs, in the fog, in the silence, in the long hours before dawn when the world belongs to whatever is old enough to claim it, that thing does not need your belief to exist. It exists regardless. It was there before you arrived. It will be there after you leave. And if you are very lucky, the only evidence you will ever have of its presence is a footprint in the mud and a smell on the wind and the memory of a shape at the edge of the firelight that tilted its head and looked at you and decided, for reasons you will never understand, to let you go. If you are hearing this for the first time and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I would ask you to take a moment and do so now. There are more accounts like this one, more testimonies from people who have walked into places they should not have gone and come back carrying stories they cannot put down. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below with your own experience if you have one, and if you have not had one yet, be grateful, be very, very grateful. My name is Terry George. I am 59 years old, and I know what lives in the hollows of Pine Mountain, Kentucky. I wish I did not, but I do.